There's a lack of African American men in leadership positions inside corporate America. Not because we can't lead, but because we never get those opportunities. We fail to enter management and leadership because the person evaluating and interviewing us is running HR software that was installed in 1960. That's right, 1960. Corporate leadership inherited that software. They weren't born with it. And until they're honest enough about what they inherited, and the most qualified person in the room will never get an opportunity just because of the color of their skin. Their thinking about black employees is antiquated. The HR software is old and outdated, but corporate America is still running it. It's time for a change. This podcast is the software upgrade for everyone who's ready to examine the effects of being born into racism. Welcome to the Brilliant Minds, Ignorant Minds podcast series. Actually, the series that was inspired by my new book, Brilliant Minds, Ignorant Minds. And we're up to podcast number 3 already. And I'm getting into this whole social media, podcasting platform, and it's a whole new world for me. But, you know, things are going good. Things are going good. Born into racism. I grew up in the 60s. And in the 60s, you know, as we all know, for the younger folks, you probably learned about our history. In the 60s, Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement, and he was assassinated in the 60s. Our president, JFK, was assassinated, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, the Jim Crow South. It was just a very, very tumultuous time in my childhood and in American history. It was a lot going on. Race riots throughout the country. Those 4 little girls that were bombed by the KKK in the Birmingham church, 16th Street Church. And this is what we grew up with. My parents did an excellent job with me and my brother educating us about American history and African American history, because it was brutal growing up during that time. There was so much, violence and unrest and racial strife. And yeah, it was tough. It was tough. On the other side of the coin, I'm a New Yorker. I grew up in Long Island, New York, out in the suburbs. And, I'm sure the white kids were watching the same information that we were watching on TV. But, these white kids, they grew up with white privilege. They understood that they were at the top of the racial hierarchy. I mean, they went to private schools. They lived in segregated communities, wealthy communities, and, life was just different. They saw the 60s through a different lens. Let me put it that way. Their parents contextualized all the black violence as, those black people they're just violent, they're rebel rousers, they're troublemakers, and we don't want them in our community. And turn the TV off or change the channel. And whereas the black kids grew up, we knew, from Martin Luther King and everything else that was going on, that racism was wrong. Segregation and discrimination was wrong. And black people were bearing the brunt of all that, of all those laws that were against the Jim Crow South, and even being in New York. My dad sat me down as a little kid. I must have been maybe 12. I don't even think I was a teenager yet. And he asked me what I knew about the police. And he told me, he said, the police are very dangerous. Have respect for the police. They can take your life over nothing. You make a wrong move, you could be shot dead. So be very respectful of the police, because dealing with law enforcement in this country, it's a no-win situation. I mean, I know you look at TV and you see what's going on in Birmingham, Alabama, and Mississippi. Don't get it twisted. New York is, it's the same, belief by law enforcement. So be very aware of the police. And that was a message, 15 years later, or how many years it was, I gave to my son 20 years later. About the same thing, because this is what, young black men growing up had to deal with. You had to be aware of that. And, I'm sure my white classmates was a totally different, way of life. They saw, America through that lens of white privilege. And they didn't have to deal with it. They didn't have to worry about the police. They wanted to be police when they grew up. So it was a very different way that each, group of people, African Americans and whites, were born into racism. Because as you're growing up in your teen years and you're becoming an adult, it affects you. Your childhood, the things you went through that you grew up with, it will definitely affect you. And each, the black kids, it was affected us one way, and the white kids, it affected them another way. Some of them, were aware of what was going on, but they were just raised in this environment that, they had an understanding that white privilege, and they were at the top of the racial hierarchy, and everyone else was beneath them. And for a while, that's how it was, and that's how it still is in some instances. And imagine, growing up with that. So now when these white kids get into corporate America, and the black kids also get into corporate America, they still see us the same way that they did in 1960. The software was never updated. Those are all, it's an antiquated way of thinking. You have African Americans in the workforce that are excellent at what they do, brilliant minds, ready to lend, their expertise, but because of that baggage. Because what happens after we're grown, we're adults. I'm an African American man. You have a Caucasian man. He's got the corporate job. He's got the high salary. He's got the prestigious title, and he's a decision maker. And he sees a black candidate come in, and it's that same mentality. Blacks they can be dangerous. Let me deal with them with kid gloves. I'm not sure, if this is a black man, how's he going to fit with the team? Is he going to be able to work with us? All of this antiquated thinking. And so because of that thinking, they're stuck, and the message of this particular podcast and the book, is get over it. White America, get over this obsession with skin color, because it's counterproductive to the whole population. You're holding everybody back. It's a multiracial time, the browning of America, as they say. So, we got to get over this, being stuck on skin color and racism. And we've got to work on that.
Hello, my name is Sir Dr. James Dentley. I'm here to talk about Vernon O'Gara, who is in Chicago for the Inspired to Speak Action Camp. And this gentleman is absolutely incredible. Not only his story, but also his passion to make a difference. His passion and his determination to stand up for justice for all. And I really mean that. This gentleman has taken his story and shared it with us in a way that we know it comes from an authentic place. It was heartfelt, but also informative, and very, very important and impactful. He's talking about how we can position ourselves that we can have a level playing field. that we can operate in fairness, that we can operate inside of our power, that we do the work, we can be rewarded for it. So if you want to get a speaker or someone to come in front of your organization and talk about how to get justice from injustice, how to make a way when sometimes you feel like there is no way, I highly recommend that you get Vernon in front of your group, because he'll knock it out the park and do a great job for you, and it'll be an authentic way and something that he lives in and stands for, honestly, every single day. Vernon O'Gara, that's the man you need.
So how do we work on this? I think we work on it by, looking at the research. Because even myself, I had to understand, what was going on. And I knew I was going to do this podcast, and I was researching a few articles. And just let me share this with you. Research on whiteness and psychology tells us something uncomfortable. Racism can foster chronic fear, status anxiety, and hostility in white people, particularly when they anticipate contact or competition with black people. That's not a radical claim. That's documented mental health data. And that was from the Journal of Social Issues, So it's like researching this stuff because I'm like, the messaging that we get, everything is fairness and there's no more racism and everything is all fine and dandy and, life is hunky-dory. No, I mean, what are the, I'm just struggling to see what is white America looking at when they make those type of statements. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And let me just interject one other thing. Another way that that they framed this whole thing of racism was with the banks. Remember, I shared with you, I'm from New York, financial district. All the banks are here. And so also what happened in the 60s, maybe I would say maybe the 70s, is that America started letting all these foreign banks in. And you had China, Germany, India, Middle Eastern banks, Canada, the UK, Venezuela, South America, all of these countries started, banking in the United States. And so what that did was all the immigrants that were coming in during that time had access to cash, access to capital. And, it just created an atmosphere where, white folks look at, man, look at this person's from China or this person's from India. They're doing well. What's wrong with black people? Well, what's wrong with black people? We don't have access to capital. Those other foreigners, they have access to capital. They can go right down to, the bank of their choice, the bank of their country. And I've seen these banks in the financial district, New York City, that in Wall Street area, you'd be amazed. You see so many different countries, it'll make your head spin. But no African American banks, though. That's the thing. Where can I go to get money? Yeah, you can go anywhere. Yeah, you can go anywhere, but you're not going to get our rate of, getting money for businesses and, corporations and building up our communities. We don't get money like that. So so what does it do? It creates a situation where, white America says, oh, blacks are lazy. They don't fix up their communities. They don't do this. They don't do that. In the meantime, now we have to deal with, a certain, ethnic group of people come in and they buy up all the real estate in the black community, all the real estate. Another ethnic persuasion comes in and they open up all the convenience stores and fast food restaurants. Another group comes in and they open up car dealerships. All of a sudden you got all these car dealerships popping all up. Yeah, let me sell this black man a Cadillac. But none of it is black owned because we don't have access to capital. So this all feeds in to racism. Being born into racism. It's, I can go on and on about this. I'm not going to try to make a history lesson, but the white kids grow up and they see this, and they know they have their white privilege, and in society, in the racial hierarchy, so they're not worried about immigrants. Oh, let them come. I don't care what they do. They're not on my level, which they're not. And so with this background, with this bringing up, with this being raised in racism, how do you expect both groups to be the same? How do you expect the white graduates and the white graduates and the black graduates, how do you expect them to, they have such dissimilar backgrounds growing up? How do you expect them to be the same when you're sitting there at an interview, when you're applying for that corporate job? So now the guy that you grew up with is now, running a company. And others like him are running the company. And as a black man, you come in, you have all this baggage. Oh, man. I hope I don't get under this guy's skin. I hope he's not racist. That he's not going to like me because I'm black. Let me make sure I say, I speak to him the right way, because, if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to be out the door. I won't get the job. And all this anxiety, with these interviews. You think white people have that anxiety at all? Of course not. They go into jobs, they probably know that they're going to get the job. They're not worried about their qualifications. They have their resume. Regardless of if they have the qualifications or they don't, they still have a leg up on the African-American person. It's probably a good chance they're gonna get the job. So both interviews, the white person is free and easy, no anxiety, and just can flow. And when I go in the interview and other African-American men, I'm like, damn, I wonder what kind of guy is this, or what kind of gal is she? Am I intimidating her? That's what I used to get all the time. You say, oh, Vern, you're a smart guy, you're tall, you're dark, you intimidate people. And I would chuckle, because I'm like, I'm the nicest guy in the world. I'm not going to intimidate anyone. But again, it's that conditioning. How were you raised? Maybe, your boss could be a guy, he was 10 years old and a black kid beat him up. He's gonna always remember that. Who knows what's in his head? But that's the anxiety that you think about, in an interview. So be true to what you said on paper. Martin Luther King made a very profound statement, and it was, be true to what you put on paper. And everybody's familiar with this. I just want to read this. It's the HR policy. Now, Martin Luther King, of course, he was talking about emancipation, proclamation, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, all men are created equal. We know what Dr. King was talking about. But there are so many documents in corporate America. And the HR policy, be true to what you put on paper. It's very simple what Dr. King said. The HR policy, how many of you have heard this? We are an equal opportunity employer, and all qualified applicants will receive consideration for employment or promotion without regard to race, color, religion, sex, creed, yada, 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 yada. We've all heard it before, okay? But it's a double standard for African Americans, especially for African American men. There's no way you will receive consideration for employment or promotion without regard to race? That is not true. That is not true, and I can speak to the fact that that is not true. At my past employer, and I only stopped working a year ago, so it's not like I'm talking about, in that far in the past. There were a lack of African American men in management. So how can you say I'm treated fairly? And I used to always tell my employer, the few times I got into, filing complaints and complaining about the lack of black men and whatever, I used to tell them, I have other colleagues, African American male colleagues, and everybody basically has the same experience in corporate America. My colleagues across the country, I joined a healthcare association and I traveled around the country. And I talked to my other African American colleagues, and it was always the same theme. Hey, I come into work, I come in early, I stay late, I go to the extra yard, I get the certification, and my boss could care less. He could care less. I apply for promotions over and over again. They always either bring in someone that I have to train, or they give it to one of their friends, or, one of the ladies will get the position, diversity, they would call, or whatever. And, you'd have these leadership teams with no black men at all, not one. And I always say follow the money. All the six-figure jobs, lack of black men. It could be 300 or 400 women and 500 white guys, and they're all making six-figure salary. But, there might be one black man there with, another 500 employees that's getting paid. One, or, no, maybe we have two. So, let me just end with this. Corporate America, they don't know how good they can be unless they have a seat at the table for everyone. This antiquated attitude about black men and that we can't lead. No, it's not that we can't lead. We never get the opportunity to lead. And that's what's lacking, and that's what happens when you continue to practice racism. You continue to have this 1960 playbook, this 1960 computer software that, you're just married to, and you can't give it up. You can't give it up. And it's time for that to end. So, I understand, being born into racism, it will affect you in so many ways. Here's another, the same Journal of Social Issues. That fear and white privilege doesn't evaporate when those kids grow up and enter corporate America. I get it. I get it. That's how you came up. But you got to let it go. You got to let it go. But that's how being born into racism can affect us. So think about that, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the podcast. I'll be back. Next week, we're going to discuss the dynamic between African American men and African American women inside the corporate American workplace. Now, that's going to be a hot topic. So that'll be our next discussion. And before I sign off, brilliantignorantminds.com is the website. brilliantignorantminds.com. So you can check out the website. There's a book trailer in there. There's some other information about the book at the website. And before, one more thing I just want to add is share my deepest condolences to the Jackson family. Reverend Jesse Jackson recently transitioned, and just, a great man that took the mantle of Martin Luther King and just continued on the struggle for civil rights and, the better life for African American people. That was Jesse Jackson, a great man, and I want to send my respects to his family. So I look forward to seeing everybody again next week. Thank you for watching. Hit that like button and share button. Thank you very much.